Long ago, more than 60 years in the past, the United States of America entered one of its most unforgettable decades, the 1960s. It was a time filled with dreams, courage, and change. But it was also a time of fear, anger, and heartbreak. People often call the 1960s a decade of hope and tension because it carried both light and shadow in equal measure. The world had just come out of the 1950s, a decade of peace after World War II, but also a time when two powerful nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, were competing for control of the future. This competition was called the Cold War. Missiles, spies, and space rockets all became symbols of this invisible battle between democracy and communism. People built bomb shelters in their backyards, and school children practiced hiding under desks during nuclear drills. Fear of war hung quietly in the air. But while the Cold War created fear, it also created progress. Scientists worked harder, engineers dreamed bigger. The race to space had begun. And at home, something even more important was starting: a race for equality. Even though America was a strong and growing country, not everyone lived with equal rights. In the South, many Black Americans faced segregation, unfair laws that separated them from white people in schools, buses, restaurants, and even bathrooms. Signs that said whites only or colored only could be seen across towns. Imagine being told where you could sit, where you could eat, or where you could live, just because of the color of your skin. That was the painful reality for millions. But things were beginning to change. Young men and women, both black and white, began to speak up. They joined marches, sat in protest at lunch counters, and sang songs of freedom. They wanted to show that love and nonviolence could be stronger than hate. One of the strongest voices in this growing movement was a pastor from Atlanta, Georgia, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He spoke not with anger, but with peace. He said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." His dream was simple but powerful, a world where children of all colors could grow up as equals. While the streets echoed with calls for justice, another kind of leader appeared on the national stage, a young, confident senator from Massachusetts named John Fitzgerald Kennedy. In 1960, America was preparing for a new presidential election. The country had seen many older presidents before, but Kennedy was different. He was young, energetic, and spoke with hope. He talked about building a better America, one that looked toward the stars, cared for the poor, and led the world with courage instead of fear. When Kennedy debated his opponent, Richard Nixon, on television, millions watched. For the first time in history, people could see the candidates side by side. Kennedy looked calm, confident, and full of life. Nixon looked tired and nervous. Television changed everything. People didn't just hear the news anymore, they saw it. And what they saw made them believe that Kennedy represented the future. When the election results came in, John F. Kennedy became the 35th President of the United States. He was only 43 years old, the youngest elected president in American history. His wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, was elegant and smart, admired by people everywhere. Together, they brought a sense of youth and hope to the White House that the nation had never seen before. President Kennedy called his vision for America the New Frontier. To him, the new frontier meant exploring new ideas, fighting poverty, supporting civil rights, and reaching for the stars. Literally. He said, "We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils." His speeches inspired people to dream again. He challenged Americans to serve their country and to think beyond themselves. His most famous words still echo through time. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Those words touched millions of hearts. Young people joined volunteer programs, scientists worked on space missions, and the country began to feel united in purpose. But behind the smiles in his speeches, the world was still dangerous. In 1961, a small group of Cuban exiles tried to invade Cuba and overthrow its communist government. The plan failed badly. The event known as the Bay of Pigs invasion embarrassed the new president and made America look weak. Kennedy accepted the blame publicly, but he learned from his mistake. He became more careful, wiser, and determined not to let his country fall into war again. The biggest test of Kennedy's leadership came in 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. American spy planes had discovered Soviet missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. coast. These missiles could reach American cities in minutes. It was the closest the world had ever come to nuclear war. For 13 long days, the world held its breath. Would the two superpowers destroy each other? Would civilization end? Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev exchanged secret letters, threats, and negotiations. In the end, Kennedy made a bold but peaceful choice. He ordered a naval blockade around Cuba and demanded that the missiles be removed. Finally, an agreement was reached. The Soviets would take their missiles out of Cuba, and the U.S. would quietly remove its missiles from Turkey. War was avoided. The world sighed in relief, and Kennedy became a hero of peace. People realized that strength was not just about weapons. It was about wisdom and restraint. While Kennedy was dealing with the world's threats, Martin Luther King Jr. was dealing with the nation's heart. The civil rights movement was growing fast. In 1963, hundreds of thousands of people gathered in Washington, D.C. for a peaceful protest called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. From the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. King gave one of the greatest speeches in history, the I Have a Dream speech. He spoke of a day when people would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He dreamed of a time when little black boys and little white girls could hold hands as equals. Millions watched it on television. Many cried. Even President Kennedy watched from the White House and praised the marchers for their courage. It felt as if America was finally moving toward a better, fairer future. But deep inside, anger was rising in some corners of the country. Racists and extremists hated the idea of equality. They threatened, attacked, and tried to silence those who demanded change. And in the middle of that tension stood three men, Kennedy, King, and Robert Kennedy, all trying to bring hope to a country struggling with its conscience. The 1960s were also the first true television decade. For the first time, people saw world events not days later, but live, as they happened. They watched rocket launches, protests, presidential speeches, and even wars in faraway countries, all from their living rooms. Television made heroes and history visible, but it also meant that when tragedy struck, people would watch that too, and never forget it. By the early 1960s, America was a land of contrasts. Children watched cartoons and dreamed of becoming astronauts. At the same time, news reports showed violence in the South, bombings at churches, and soldiers in Vietnam. It was a time when the best and worst of humanity could be seen on the same screen. The younger generation began to question everything: war, inequality, and even government power. College students protested for peace. Women began demanding equal rights. Artists and musicians used songs to call for love and justice. The word change echoed everywhere. People wanted a new kind of world, one that was fairer, freer, and more compassionate. John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy became symbols of that new world. They weren't perfect, but they represented courage, progress, and the belief that individuals could make a difference. They gave people hope that politics could be noble, that leadership could be compassionate, and that love could defeat hate. But as history has often shown, moments of great hope can be followed by moments of great loss. By late 1963, Kennedy was preparing for his next presidential campaign. He planned to visit Texas, a state where political tensions were high. He wanted to build support and remind people that America was strong and united. Martin Luther King Jr. continued his marches for civil rights. Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, was serving as Attorney General, fighting organized crime and protecting civil rights activists. Together, they represented a generation of leaders who believed in service and compassion. But something dark was brewing: anger, extremism, and hatred that refused to disappear. Some people saw these leaders not as heroes, but as threats to their old way of life. And soon, that anger would explode into violence that would shock the world and break the hearts of millions. In the fall of 1963, John F. Kennedy arrived in Dallas, Texas. He was greeted by cheering crowds and waving flags. People lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the smiling young president and his graceful wife, Jackie. No one could imagine what would happen next. But before we reach that day, November 22nd, 1963, we must understand what it meant for the people of America. They had placed their hopes, their dreams, and their trust in these young leaders. To them, Kennedy, King, and Robert Kennedy weren't just men. They were symbols of a brighter tomorrow. The story of what happened next would change not only their lives, but the soul of a nation. The 1960s began with light, hope in new technology, dreams of the stars, the rise of human rights, and the promise of peace. But behind the light, shadows waited. America stood at a crossroads, between love and hate, between unity and division. No one knew it yet, but the decade that began with promise would soon be remembered for its pain. The stage was set, the leaders were chosen, and history was about to take a turn that would be felt forever. When John Fitzgerald Kennedy became president in January 1961, America felt young again. He was not just another politician. He was a symbol of energy, hope, and change. To millions of Americans, he represented the best version of their country, brave, modern, and full of possibility. Kennedy's smile, his confidence, and his calm way of speaking made people believe that the future could be bright. His wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, brought beauty and grace to the White House. For the first time, the president and his family looked like the people you might see in a movie, charming, stylish, and full of life. The media began calling their time in the White House Camelot, after the legendary kingdom of King Arthur, a magical time of hope and idealism. People believed that under Kennedy's leadership, America could become a fairer and kinder nation. But behind the smiles and television cameras, President Kennedy faced a world full of danger and challenges. From the moment he took office, Kennedy made it clear that he wanted to push America forward, not backward. He believed in science, education, and progress. He spoke of a new frontier, not of land, but of knowledge, peace, and equality. In his first speech as president, he said words that would echo through history. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Those simple words inspired millions, especially young Americans. People began to volunteer in programs like the Peace Corps, helping poor communities around the world. Students dreamed of becoming astronauts or engineers. Even farmers and workers felt proud to be part of something larger than themselves. Kennedy's America was full of optimism. But optimism alone was not enough to protect the country from its problems. Early in his presidency, Kennedy had to face a crisis. In April 1961, A group of Cuban exiles, supported by parts of the U.S. government, invaded Cuba, trying to overthrow its communist leader, Fidel Castro. The invasion failed terribly. The plan, called the Bay of Pigs invasion, became a national embarrassment. The young president took responsibility even though the plan had been made before he took office. He said, "Victory has 100 fathers, but defeat is an orphan." Those words showed his honesty and courage. He learned an important lesson, that mistakes could be powerful teachers. Instead of giving up, Kennedy grew stronger. He decided to trust his own judgment more and listen to fewer secret advisors who pushed for war. The world was entering a dangerous time, and Kennedy knew that every decision he made could affect millions of lives. Just a year later, in October 1962, Kennedy faced the greatest test of his life, the Cuban Missile Crisis. American spy planes had discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being built in Cuba, only 90 miles from the United States. These missiles could strike major U.S. cities within minutes. The discovery sent shockwaves through the world. People feared that a nuclear war was about to begin. For 13 long days, the world held its breath. Would the U.S. attack Cuba? Would the Soviet Union strike back? Would humanity survive? Kennedy had to decide between two terrible options: invade Cuba and risk nuclear war, or find another way. He chose peace. He ordered a naval blockade around Cuba to stop Soviet ships from bringing in more weapons. He also secretly communicated with Soviet leader Khrushchev to find a way out of the crisis. After days of tension, the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba and to later remove American missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended peacefully. No bombs fell, no lives were lost. Kennedy's calm and courage saved the world from destruction. His approval ratings soared, and people began to see him as a man of wisdom and restraint. He had learned that true strength comes not from fear, but from self-control. While Kennedy was protecting peace abroad, he also began to face the growing struggle for civil rights at home. In the early 1960s, America was still divided by race. Black citizens were often denied the right to vote, forced to attend separate schools, and treated unfairly in everyday life. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and thousands of others were leading peaceful protests to change that, but they were met with violence, police dogs, fire hoses, and angry mobs. At first, Kennedy was cautious. He wanted change, but he also feared angering powerful Southern politicians. But as the movement grew stronger, Kennedy's heart began to shift. In June 1963, he gave one of his most powerful speeches. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities. Those words made history. He called civil rights a matter of morality, not just law. It was one of the first times a U.S. president spoke so clearly in defense of racial equality. Dr. King later said that Kennedy's words were a turning point. Kennedy was not only thinking about Earth, he was looking toward the stars. In 1961, he stood before Congress and said, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No one had ever said such a bold thing before. At that time, the idea sounded almost impossible. The Soviet Union was ahead in space exploration.
They had already sent the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit. But Kennedy believed that America's greatest strength was its creativity. He encouraged scientists, engineers, and dreamers to reach higher. His speech at Rice University captured the imagination of the world. We choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Those words became legendary. They reminded people that challenges make us stronger, and that even the hardest tasks are worth trying if they push humanity forward. Kennedy's space vision would later come true, 6 years after his death, when astronauts walked on the moon in 1969. It was his dream that set the journey in motion. By 1963, Kennedy had been president for nearly 3 years. He had faced crises, made peace, and inspired millions. But not everyone loved him. Some people disliked his stance on civil rights. Others thought he was too soft on communism. Conspiracy theories and hate-filled letters reached the White House every day. Still, Kennedy believed in meeting people face to face, even in places where he wasn't popular. He wanted to show that America could come together. That's why he planned a trip to Texas in November 1963. Texas was an important state for his re-election campaign, but it was also politically divided. Some people there supported him, others strongly opposed him. Despite warnings from advisors, Kennedy insisted on going. He said, "We're going to show them that we're not afraid." It was a bright Friday morning in Dallas, Texas. The sky was clear, the sun was shining, and crowds lined the streets to see their president. Kennedy was riding in an open-top car with his wife, Jacqueline, the Texas governor, and his wife. People cheered as the car slowly rolled through the city. Children waved flags, smiling faces filled the sidewalks. Kennedy waved back, his hair shining in the sunlight. Then, just after 12:30 p.m., as the motorcade passed through Dealey Plaza, the sound of gunfire echoed through the air. Bang, bang, bang. Panic broke out. The car sped forward. Jacqueline screamed and reached for her husband. In seconds, everything changed. John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, was shot and mortally wounded. He was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, but it was too late. At 1 p.m., doctors pronounced him dead. He was just 46 years old. News spread across the world in minutes. Television and radio interrupted their programs to deliver the heartbreaking announcement: the President of the United States has been shot. People wept openly in the streets. Schools and offices fell silent. Many couldn't believe it. It felt like a dream, a nightmare that couldn't be true. For the first time, Americans saw their grief live on television. Cameras showed the tears of news anchors, the silence of the crowds, and the sorrow of the Kennedy family. Vice President Lyndon Johnson was quickly sworn in as the new president aboard Air Force One. Beside him stood Jacqueline Kennedy, still wearing her blood-stained pink suit. She refused to change her clothes, saying, "I want them to see what they have done." It was a moment of unbearable sadness. Soon after the shooting, police arrested a man named Lee Oswald Herm. He worked at the Texas School Book Depository, the building from which the shots were fired. Oswald was charged with killing the president, but he denied it, saying, "I'm just a patsy." 2 days later, as police were transferring him to another jail, a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby stepped out of the crowd and shot Oswald, live on national television. Millions of viewers saw the shocking event unfold in real time. With Oswald dead, the mystery deepened. Why did he do it? Was he working alone? Or was there a larger plan behind it? The government formed the Warren Commission to investigate. They concluded that Oswald acted alone, but many Americans never fully believed it. Conspiracy theories spread about the CIA, the mafia, foreign governments, and more. Even today, the full truth remains debated. On November 25, 1963, the world watched as President Kennedy was laid to rest. His coffin, draped in the American flag, was carried through Washington, D.C. on a horse-drawn caisson. His young son, John Jr., just 3 years old, stood by his mother and gave a small salute to his father's coffin, a moment that broke the nation's heart. Leaders from all over the world attended the funeral. Millions watched on television, united in grief. The church bells rang, the soldiers marched slowly, and the eternal flame was lit at his grave, a flame that still burns today at Arlington National Cemetery. With Kennedy's death, America lost more than a president. It lost its sense of innocence. The man who had promised hope, courage, and progress was gone in an instant. But his ideas lived on. In the peace programs he started, in the space mission he dreamed of, and in the civil rights laws that followed soon after. People remembered his words, his charm, and his belief that every person could make a difference. Even though he ruled for less than 3 years, his impact would last for generations. The story of John F. Kennedy is both inspiring and tragic. He taught America to dream, to believe, and to reach for the impossible. He showed that leadership was not about power, but about purpose. But his death left a hole, one that could never be fully filled. For millions, it was the moment when hope turned into heartbreak. But even in grief, a new determination began to grow, to continue the journey he started, to fight for peace, equality, and justice. But as the nation tried to heal, another voice, one of love and equality, was about to fall silent too. In the next chapter, the story turns to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the man who dreamed of freedom for all and whose dream cost him his life. The world had seen tragedy before, wars, disasters, and loss, but nothing prepared America for what happened in November 1963. The death of President John F. Kennedy was not just a political event. It was a wound that cut through the heart of a nation. It changed how people saw their leaders, their government, and even their sense of safety. This chapter is about the moments after the shots were fired, the grief, the confusion, and the silence that followed. It's about how the whole world stopped to mourn one man, and how his death marked the end of an era of innocence. When the sound of the gunfire echoed through Dealey Plaza, people didn't understand what was happening. Some thought fireworks were being set off to celebrate the president's visit. Others ducked in panic as the motorcade sped away. In the car, chaos filled the air. Jacqueline Kennedy held her husband's head in her lap, whispering his name, hoping he would answer. Secret Service agents leapt onto the moving vehicle, trying to shield the president from more harm. The car raced to Parkland Memorial Hospital. Doctors and nurses rushed to save him, but the wound was too severe. At 1 p.m., the announcement came. President John F. Kennedy was dead. The word spread like fire, first through Dallas, then across Texas, then throughout America, and then the entire world. People stopped what they were doing, in schools, in offices, in factories, in homes. Some cried silently, others shouted in disbelief. It was as if the heartbeat of a country had suddenly stopped. At 4:38 p.m., a journalist named Walter Cronkite appeared on national television. With tears in his eyes, he spoke slowly. From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official. President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. For a few seconds, he could not continue speaking. He took off his glasses and tried to compose himself. Millions of Americans watching at home began to cry with him. Television for the first time became a mirror of national emotion. Every face that appeared on the screen looked shocked. Every voice trembled. Reporters who had covered wars and disasters could not hide their grief. In cities across the world, from London to Tokyo, from Moscow to Paris, flags were lowered to half-mast. Even leaders of rival nations sent messages of sorrow. The Soviet Union, which had nearly gone to war with Kennedy a year before, called his death a tragedy for all mankind. For a brief moment, the world felt united in sadness. While millions wept, no one's pain was greater than that of Jacqueline Kennedy. Just hours earlier, she had been smiling beside her husband, waving to cheering crowds. Now she was a widow, her pink suit stained with his blood. She refused to change her clothes when she returned to Washington that evening. She said quietly to an aide, "I want them to see what they have done." When she stepped off the plane with the president's body, her face was calm but empty. The world would later call her a symbol of strength and dignity, but in truth, she was simply holding herself together for her children and her country. Inside the White House, Kennedy's little children, Caroline and John Jr., didn't fully understand what had happened. Caroline kept asking when her father would come home. John Jr., just 3 years old, played with his toys, unaware that his death would soon make him part of one of the most iconic photographs in American history. In the days that followed, everything stopped. Schools closed, shops lowered their lights, churches filled with people praying quietly. Across America, people placed candles and flowers in front of Kennedy's pictures. In homes, families sat in silence, watching the endless news coverage. For 3 days, the television networks played nothing else. It was the first time the country had experienced continuous live broadcasting, and it connected everyone through shared grief. No matter who you were or where you lived, you felt like you had lost someone close to you. Only hours after the assassination, the police arrested a man named Lee Harvey Oswald. He was 24 years old, had served in the military, and had lived for a time in the Soviet Union. He worked at the Texas School Book Depository, the building overlooking Dealey Plaza. Oswald denied killing the president. When reporters shouted questions, he said, "I'm just a patsy." But before he could go to trial, something shocking happened. 2 days later, on November 24, 1963, Oswald was being moved from police headquarters to a county jail. Television cameras were broadcasting the transfer live. As Oswald walked through the basement hallway surrounded by police, a man stepped out from the crowd, pointed a gun, and fired. Oswald fell to the ground. The man with the gun was Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner. Millions of people watching on TV gasped in horror. They had just witnessed a murder live on air. With Oswald dead, the world was left without clear answers. Why had he done it? Had he acted alone? Or was there something more, a hidden plan, a larger conspiracy? The government quickly formed an investigation called the Warren Commission, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren. After months of study, the commission concluded that Oswald had acted alone, firing 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. But not everyone believed that conclusion. Some said there were 2 shooters. Others believed powerful groups wanted Kennedy gone: the CIA, the Mafia, foreign governments, or political rivals. Even decades later, the mystery has never been completely solved. Theories and documentaries continue to ask the same haunting question: who really killed JFK? On November 25, 1963, the world said its final goodbye. Kennedy's casket, covered with the American flag, was carried on a horse-drawn caisson through the streets of Washington, D.C.
The clatter of the horses' hooves echoed through the silent crowds. Soldiers marched slowly beside the casket. Foreign leaders from around the world followed behind in solemn silence. Millions watched from their homes. No one spoke. No one moved. At the church service, priests prayed for peace, and Jacqueline Kennedy stood strong, holding her children's hands. As the coffin was placed at Arlington National Cemetery, a small eternal flame was lit beside it, a fire that still burns today as a symbol of hope and remembrance. When little John Jr. saluted his father's coffin, cameras captured the moment. That single image, a tiny child saying goodbye to his father, broke the hearts of millions. It became one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. Before the assassination, many Americans had believed their leaders were untouchable, protected by destiny. But after that day, the world felt different. If a young, beloved president could be killed in broad daylight, what else was possible? People began to lose their trust in the system. They questioned everything: the government, the media, and even their own sense of security. The 1950s had been an age of stability and comfort, but the 1960s, after Kennedy's death, became an age of protest and unrest. The Vietnam War grew larger, civil rights marches became stronger, and everywhere people began to speak out, demanding truth, justice, and change. The sense of unity that Kennedy had brought began to fade into confusion and anger. In the middle of this grief, one man tried to carry the torch of hope: Robert F. Kennedy, John's younger brother. As Attorney General, Robert had been close to his brother's presidency, fighting organized crime and supporting civil rights. Now he was seen as the heir to the dream that had been cut short. He comforted his family, guided the nation through its sorrow, and became a voice for compassion and reform. He once said, "Tragedy is a tool for the living to gain wisdom, not a guide by which to live." Those words reflected his strength and his pain. Robert's deep empathy for the poor, the oppressed, and the broken-hearted began to define his politics. But his story, too, would end in tragedy, a tragedy that echoed the pain of his brother's death. Even after the shock and sorrow, the story of John F. Kennedy did not end with his death. His ideas lived on. In the peace programs he started, the civil rights laws passed under President Johnson, and the space mission that sent humans to the moon. Kennedy had once said, "A man may die, nations may rise and fall, but an idea lives on." And he was right. His idea of courage, service, and hope became part of America's identity. To this day, his speeches are studied, his voice remembered, and his words quoted by new generations who never saw him alive but still feel his influence. For many, the assassination of John F. Kennedy was not just the loss of a man, it was the loss of what America believed it could be. As the funeral ended and the days passed, the world tried to move on. President Lyndon B. Johnson took office and promised to continue Kennedy's work. The civil rights movement grew stronger, inspired by Kennedy's support and by the bravery of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But the sadness remained. It was a quiet, lingering sorrow that lived in every heart, the sense that something pure had been lost. In the years to come, America would face more tragedy, more leaders struck down by bullets. The decade that began with hope would soon become one marked by loss. The assassination of John F. Kennedy was not just the end of a presidency. It was the end of a feeling, the feeling that the world was safe, that good always triumphed, and that heroes lived long enough to see their dreams fulfilled. For the generation that lived through it, time was divided into before and after Dallas. Before, when hope was bright and the future seemed endless. After,
when the dream was shadowed by doubt. But amid this grief, another voice of hope continued to rise, the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a preacher with a dream of equality, who carried forward the same message of love and unity that Kennedy had believed in. Yet, as history would show, even his voice would soon be silenced.
When John F. Kennedy was killed in 1963, America lost a young president who spoke of hope. But another voice of hope was still alive, the voice of a preacher who dreamed of freedom and equality. His name was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. To many people, he was not just a man, he was a movement. He represented love, courage, and the power of peaceful resistance. His dream was not about power or money. It was about dignity, justice, and peace. In this chapter, we'll journey through his life, his rise as a leader, his dream that moved millions, and the day his voice was silenced forever. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, a place where the color of your skin determined almost everything about your life. He grew up in a time when African Americans were treated as second-class citizens. Schools were separate. Restaurants, buses, and even drinking fountains were labeled whites only, or colored. It was called segregation, and it was deeply unfair. But young Martin was taught something powerful by his parents, that he was just as good as anyone else. His father, a Baptist preacher, often told him, "You are somebody. Never forget that." Those words became the foundation of his faith and courage. As he grew older, Martin saw how cruel the system was. He wanted to fight back, but not with fists or anger. He wanted to fight with peace, love, and truth. When Martin went to college, he studied the teachings of a man from India, Mahatma Gandhi, who had led his people to freedom from British rule through nonviolent protest. Gandhi's belief was simple: hatred only creates more hatred, but love can change hearts. Martin decided to follow the same path. He became a pastor, and soon his powerful voice began to echo far beyond the walls of his church. He preached that the way to change an unjust world was not by violence, but by peaceful resistance. He said, "If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward." Those words inspired millions who had almost lost hope. In December 1955, a quiet act of courage sparked a revolution. A woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She was arrested. When the news spread, people were outraged. Dr. King, then only 26 years old, was chosen to lead a citywide protest. He encouraged everyone to boycott the city buses, to walk instead of ride. For over a year, thousands of African Americans refused to use the buses. They walked to work, to school, and to church, through rain and heat, united in their determination. The boycott hurt the bus company's profits and caught the world's attention. Finally, in 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. The movement had won its first major victory, and Martin Luther King Jr. became the national face of a new era, the civil rights movement. In the years that followed, Dr. King led peaceful marches across the South, in cities like Birmingham, Selma, and Albany. Each time, he and his followers faced violence, arrests, and threats. In 1963, while protesting in Birmingham, Alabama, Dr. King was arrested and put in jail.
There, he wrote one of his most famous letters, the Letter from Birmingham. He wrote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." He explained that waiting for change was no longer possible, that freedom had to be demanded peacefully but firmly. Even in jail, he remained calm and hopeful. He told his followers never to fight back with hate. He believed that love was the strongest weapon they had. By the summer of 1963, the civil rights movement had grown too big to ignore. People from all across the country, black and white, young and old, gathered in Washington, D.C. to demand jobs and freedom. On August 28, 1963, more than 250,000 people stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial. It was one of the largest peaceful gatherings in American history. Dr. King stood before the massive crowd, holding his notes, his heart beating fast. But when he began to speak, his voice carried across the city, calm and powerful. He said, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed, that all men are created equal." He spoke of a world where children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He spoke of faith, love, and a future filled with light. People cried, cheered, and sang. His words were broadcast on radio and television, reaching millions. It was a turning point, not just for America, but for humanity. Dr. King's dream began to take shape in reality. The following year, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended legal segregation in public places and banned discrimination based on race, color, or religion. Dr. King's leadership was recognized around the world. That same year, he won the Nobel Peace Prize, the youngest person ever to receive it at that time. When he accepted the award, he said, "I accept this award not for myself, but for the movement that loves peace, truth, and brotherhood." But even as laws changed, hatred did not disappear overnight. Many still resisted equality. Churches were bombed. Protesters were beaten. And Dr. King's life was constantly in danger. In 1965, Dr. King joined a campaign to secure voting rights for Black Americans. In Selma, Alabama, thousands of peaceful marchers were attacked by police with tear gas and clubs. The event became known as Bloody Sunday. Television cameras captured the violence, shocking the nation. People across America, white and black, joined in solidarity. Together, they completed a 54-mile march from Selma to Montgomery. Their courage led to the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which protected the right to vote for all citizens. Step by step, Dr. King's nonviolent movement was reshaping the soul of America. But with every victory came more threats, more hate, and more danger. As the 1960s went on, Dr. King began to speak not only about racial injustice, but also about poverty and war. He opposed the Vietnam War, saying that America could not claim to be a land of peace while killing abroad. He started new campaigns to help the poor, both black and white. He dreamed of a country where every person could live with dignity. But his growing criticism of government policies made him unpopular among some politicians and even some former allies. The FBI began spying on him, trying to discredit him. They feared his influence, his honesty, and his power to unite people. Still, he refused to be silent. He said, "The time is always right to do what is right." Those who loved him admired his bravery. Those who hated him began to see him as a threat. In early 1968, Dr. King went to Memphis, Tennessee, to support a strike by black sanitation workers who were demanding fair pay and safe conditions. He gave his last speech there on April 3, 1968, the night before his death. It was a stormy night. The sky was dark and heavy with rain. Dr. King felt tired and unwell, but he stood before a crowded church and spoke words that would become hauntingly prophetic. He said, "I've been to the mountaintop, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." People cheered, but some also cried because it sounded like a goodbye. The next evening, on April 4, 1968, Dr. King stepped out onto the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. He smiled and waved to friends below. A moment later, a rifle bullet struck him. He fell instantly. At just 39 years old, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was gone. When news of his death spread, cities across America erupted in grief and anger. Riots broke out in over 100 cities. People cried in the streets, unable to believe that the man who preached peace had been killed by violence. President Johnson declared a national day of mourning. Robert Kennedy, campaigning for president at the time, gave a heartfelt speech that calmed a crowd in Indianapolis. He said softly, "What we need in the United States is not division. What we need is not hatred, but love and compassion toward one another." Dr. King's funeral took place in Atlanta. Tens of thousands walked behind his simple wooden coffin, which was carried on a mule-drawn cart, just as he had wanted. His favorite song, "Take My Hand, Precious Lord," was sung as the crowd wept. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did not live to see his dream fully realized, but because of him, the world changed forever. His movement ended legal segregation, inspired new generations of activists, and showed that peaceful protest could move mountains. His words continue to echo. "I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear." Schools are now named after him. His birthday became a national holiday in the United States, a day to remember not just his life, but his message. And his dream of equality, dignity, and love continues to guide people all over the world. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. taught humanity that the greatest power we have is love. He showed that courage does not mean fighting back. It means standing tall without fear. When he was taken from the world, it felt as though the dream had died with him. But dreams do not die. They move from one heart to another. As America mourned his loss, another man, one who shared his hope and compassion, began to rise. Robert Kennedy, the brother of the slain president, would now carry that torch of unity. But just like his brother and Dr. King, his path too would end in tragedy. When President John F. Kennedy was killed in 1963, the world stood still. But amid the sorrow, one man quietly stepped forward to carry on his brother's dream. Robert Francis Kennedy, known to many simply as Bobby. He was not just the younger brother of a fallen president. He was a man with a powerful conscience, deep compassion, and an unshakable belief in justice. Where John had inspired hope, Robert inspired healing. He became a voice for the poor, the forgotten, and the brokenhearted, a light in one of America's darkest times. Robert Kennedy was born in 1925, the seventh of 9 children in the Kennedy family. He was quieter and more serious than his brothers, but also deeply loyal and determined. During his youth, he served in the Navy during World War II and later studied law. He was intelligent and driven, but what truly defined him was his sense of duty. When John decided to run for president, Robert became his campaign manager, his closest advisor, strategist, and protector. He organized every detail, fought political battles, and made sure his brother's vision was clear and strong. Many called him tough, even ruthless in politics, but behind that sharp exterior was a heart that felt deeply for people in pain. His toughness came from care, not cruelty. When John became president, Robert was appointed Attorney General. He was just 35 years old, one of the youngest ever to hold the position. As Attorney General, Robert Kennedy used his power not for privilege, but for purpose. He fought organized crime, challenged corruption, and most importantly, stood up for civil rights. He worked closely with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the most dangerous years of the civil rights struggle. When activists were attacked in the South, Robert made sure federal officers protected them. When King was arrested, Robert quietly worked behind the scenes to help secure his release. Still, not everyone approved. Some politicians called him too emotional. Others accused him of being too sympathetic to the civil rights movement. But Robert believed justice had to be blind, that every person, no matter their color or background, deserved equality. He once said, "Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy, those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance." Those words captured who he was, a man of conscience in a time of chaos. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, Robert was devastated. He withdrew from public life for a while, consumed by grief. Friends said he was never the same again. He often visited his brother's grave alone. He read poetry about death and destiny. He struggled to find meaning in what had happened. But slowly, something began to awaken inside him, a deeper understanding of human pain. He realized that the only way to honor his brother's memory was to continue his work. In 1964, he ran for U.S. Senate from New York and won. As a senator, he traveled across America, not to the rich cities, but to the poorest towns, to Native American reservations, to migrant camps, and to rural communities forgotten by the government. He sat with children who had no food, listened to farmers who had no work, and promised to fight for them. Robert Kennedy's heart had always been strong, but now it was wide open.
By the late 1960s, America was deeply divided. The Vietnam War had torn the nation apart. Young people protested in the streets. Racism and poverty were still powerful. And then, in April 1968, tragedy struck again. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. That night, Robert Kennedy was campaigning in Indianapolis, Indiana. He was about to speak to a large crowd, most of whom had not yet heard the news. His advisors warned him not to go. The crowd might turn angry or violent. But he insisted. Standing on the back of a flatbed truck in the dark, surrounded by thousands of mourners, Robert spoke from his heart, without notes, without preparation, just pure human empathy. He said, "What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another." Then, for the first time publicly, he spoke about his own pain. "For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and distrust, I can only say that I feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States to understand and to go beyond these rather difficult times. That night, while riots broke out in more than 100 American cities, Indianapolis remained peaceful because one man chose to speak from love instead of fear. That moment became one of the most powerful speeches in American history. Short, simple, and full of truth. After King's death, the country seemed lost. People were desperate for a leader who could heal the wounds of war and injustice, and many saw Robert Kennedy as that leader. In March 1968, he announced his candidacy for President of the United States. His campaign was filled with energy, passion, and idealism. He didn't speak like other politicians. He didn't make grand promises. He spoke about love, fairness, and unity. He told Americans that they had to care for one another, especially for the poor and the powerless. Everywhere he went, crowds followed him. Young people, minorities, workers, and families who saw him as the voice of their pain and hope. In his speeches, he spoke of ending the Vietnam War, fighting poverty, and building a more compassionate America. He said, "Some men see things as they are and say, 'Why?' I dream things that never were and say, 'Why not?'" That quote became the heart of his campaign. On June 4, 1968, Robert Kennedy won the California Democratic primary, a crucial step toward the presidency. That night, at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, he addressed a cheering crowd. He smiled as he spoke his final words from the podium. "So, my thanks to all of you. Now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there." The room erupted in applause. People shouted, "Bobby, Bobby." He waved, shook hands, and walked through a narrow kitchen passage to meet reporters waiting ahead. And then, in an instant, it all changed. A young man named Sirhan Sirhan stepped forward and fired multiple shots. Robert Kennedy fell to the ground. Chaos filled the hallway. "Is everybody okay?" he whispered weakly as others screamed around him. He was rushed to the hospital, but never regained consciousness. The next day, June 6, 1968, Robert Kennedy died. He was just 42 years old. When the news spread, it felt like history was repeating itself. First John, then Martin, and now Robert. 3 men of peace taken by violence. People across the country fell into silence. Some said they could no longer bear the pain. It felt as if the decade itself had broken under the weight of tragedy. Television stations once again filled with black and white images of mourning. Robert's body was flown to New York, where thousands came to pay their respects as he lay in state at St. Patrick's Cathedral. When the funeral train carried his coffin from New York City to Washington, D.C., millions stood along the tracks, waving flags, holding signs, crying, and praying. Children stood on rooftops. Workers stopped their machines. Farmers took off their hats. The train moved slowly through the heart of America, a final farewell to the man who had cared so deeply for its people. At Arlington National Cemetery, Robert Kennedy was buried beside his brother, President John F. Kennedy. 2 eternal flames now burned there, symbols of 2 lives cut short, but never forgotten. Robert Kennedy's death marked the end of an extraordinary chapter in American history. In less than 5 years, 3 of the country's most inspiring leaders, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy, had all been assassinated. Each had stood for hope, for peace, and for justice. Each had challenged people to be better, kinder, and braver. And each had paid the ultimate price for that vision.
But together they left behind something greater than any speech or law. They left behind a moral compass for humanity. Robert once said, "It is from numberless diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped. Each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others, he sends forth a ripple of hope." Those ripples continued long after he was gone, in the civil rights laws passed, in the youth movements that followed, and in the millions of people who still believe compassion can change the world. Robert Kennedy carried the torch of his brother's dream and the spirit of Dr. King's faith. He believed that love could conquer hate, and that understanding could heal division. His death, like theirs, left a hole in the heart of America. But even in death, his voice still whispers the same message, that every act of kindness, every stand for justice, and every word of truth sends out ripples that never fade. As the 1960s neared their end, the country stood scarred, yet awakened. The assassinations of John, Martin, and Robert Kennedy had changed everything: politics, society, and the nation's soul. In the next and final chapter, we will see how those years of tragedy reshaped America forever, how the loss of three dreamers forced a nation to look inward and redefine what freedom, justice, and unity truly meant. By the end of the 1960s, the United States was a country forever changed. The decade had begun with promise, a young president, a booming economy, and dreams of equality and progress. But it ended with grief, doubt, and questions that still echo through time. Three voices of hope, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert F. Kennedy, had all been silenced by bullets. Yet their words still lived in the hearts of millions. Their deaths were not the end of their stories. They became symbols, reminders that courage, compassion, and justice never truly die. This is the story of how those assassinations transformed a nation, how they forced America to grow, to question itself, and to search for meaning in loss. In the early 1960s, Americans believed in the power of progress. Science, technology, and youthful optimism filled the air. The nation had heroes, astronauts, presidents, and civil rights leaders. But after the tragedies, something shifted deep within the American soul. The assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963 had already shaken the people's faith. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed in 1968, the grief turned to anger. And when Robert Kennedy was murdered only 2 months later, that anger became exhaustion. Many felt that hope itself had been shot. The television, once a window to inspiration, now brought images of funerals, riots, and war. The faces of leaders who had promised peace were replaced by soldiers fighting in Vietnam, students protesting in the streets, and cities burning with unrest. The dream of the early 1960s, the dream of a unified, idealistic America, seemed to have died with them. Before the 1960s, people trusted their government and believed in its leaders. But after watching 3 assassinations, a controversial war, and waves of social conflict, that trust began to fade. Conspiracy theories about the deaths of Kennedy, King, and Robert Kennedy spread rapidly. Many Americans began to believe that unseen powers, the government, the CIA, or powerful elites controlled events from behind the curtain. The phrase, "we don't know who to believe anymore," became common. It was the birth of public skepticism, a deep questioning of authority that still shapes American politics today. But while faith in institutions weakened, a new kind of power began to grow, the power of the people. The deaths of these leaders awakened something profound in the youth of America.
Students who once followed quietly now spoke loudly. They marched, protested, and demanded justice, not only for civil rights, but also against war and inequality. In music, in art, and in literature, the voices of the young began to challenge the old. Folk songs carried messages of peace. Rock music became a cry for freedom. The 1960s were no longer about comfort, they were about change. Dr. King had said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. His words inspired young activists who continued his mission. Groups fought for women's rights, Native American rights, and environmental protection. The world began to see that justice was not a single battle, it was a lifelong journey. After the tragedies, politicians could no longer ignore the cries for change. President Lyndon B. Johnson, who took office after Kennedy's death, passed major laws to honor his predecessor's vision. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were two of the most important laws in American history. They ended legal segregation and protected every citizen's right to vote.
Johnson also launched programs to fight poverty, education reforms, food programs, and health care for the poor. These efforts were called the Great Society. But the Vietnam War overshadowed much of this progress. Every night, the news showed young soldiers dying in jungles thousands of miles away. Protests filled college campuses, and many began to question whether the government truly represented the people's will. Still, through all the chaos, the spirit of the 1960s, the belief in equality, peace, and love continued to glow like a candle in the dark. The pain of the assassinations changed not just politics, but culture itself. People began to think differently about race, gender, freedom, and what it meant to live a meaningful life. Television, art, and movies reflected these changes. Films began showing more real and emotional stories. Music carried deeper messages about war, love, loss, and unity. Famous artists and songwriters like Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and the Beatles sang about peace and justice. Songs like Blowin' in the Wind and Imagine became anthems of hope. The counterculture, a movement of people who rejected traditional values, spread across cities. They wore colorful clothes, preached love and peace, and questioned materialism. The world was changing fast, and America was leading that change, not through power, but through expression. But beneath the peace signs and songs, the pain still lingered. People missed the moral guidance of the Kennedys and Dr. King. They missed leaders who spoke to their hearts instead of their fears. Even after their deaths, the influence of John, Martin, and Robert continued to shape the world. John F. Kennedy's dream of exploring space led America to the moon in 1969. When Neil Armstrong took that first step on the lunar surface, many people thought of Kennedy's words, "We choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard." Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of equality inspired movements far beyond America. His philosophy of nonviolence became a model for leaders like Nelson Mandela in South Africa and countless others who fought oppression peacefully. Robert Kennedy's compassion and belief in social justice inspired generations of politicians, human rights workers, and ordinary citizens.
His idea of ripples of hope became a guiding message for anyone who believed in change through kindness. Together, these three men became more than individuals. They became symbols of courage, faith, and the belief that one person can change the world. The assassinations of the 1960s taught the world painful but important lessons. They reminded people that progress is fragile, that freedom and justice require constant protection. They showed that even in a modern, civilized nation, hatred and violence can strike down its brightest lights. But they also revealed something beautiful: the resilience of the human spirit. Each time the nation fell into grief, it found the strength to rise again. Each time a dreamer was silenced, others stood up to carry the dream forward. The 1960s proved that ideas are stronger than bullets, that courage can outlive fear. It was a decade that broke hearts but opened minds, a decade that ended lives but started movements. When the 1970s began, America was no longer the same country it had been 10 years earlier. It was wiser, sadder, and more self-aware. The people had learned to question authority, to speak up against injustice, and to demand truth from those in power. They had also learned the cost of silence, that evil grows when good people do nothing. The fight for civil rights continued. Women began organizing for equal pay and opportunity. Environmentalists pushed for cleaner air and water. And veterans returning from Vietnam demanded honesty about war and peace. All these movements, every protest, every reform, carried the spirit of the 1960s. They carried the voices of John, Martin, and Robert. Even in sorrow, hope has a way of returning. By the late 1960s, a new generation of Americans began to believe again, not in perfection, but in progress. They built on what their heroes had started. They voted, marched, volunteered, and created art that kept the dream alive. The eternal flame at Arlington Cemetery became more than a grave marker. It became a symbol, a reminder that light never truly goes out. It may flicker in the wind, but it endures. In classrooms, children learned about Dr. King's dream. In speeches, politicians quoted Robert Kennedy's words, and in hearts across the nation, people still whispered the promise of John F. Kennedy's vision. Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. Looking back, the 1960s were not just years on a calendar. They were a turning point in human history. The assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy were like thunderclaps that shook the conscience of the world. They reminded everyone that leadership is not about power, but about purpose, that change does not come from anger, but from empathy, and that one person, with courage, compassion, and conviction, can light a fire that no bullet can extinguish. The decade that began with hope and ended with heartbreak gave birth to a new kind of America, one that would forever strive to be better, braver, and more just. As time passed, monuments were built, streets renamed, and holidays created to honor these men. But their real memorials are not made of stone. They live in the actions of ordinary people who choose kindness over cruelty, truth over lies, and unity
over division. The story of the 1960s is not only a story of tragedy, it is a story of transformation. It is a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit can rise, forgive, and rebuild. John F. Kennedy once said, "One person can make a difference, and everyone should try." Martin Luther King Jr. said, "The time is always right to do what is right." And Robert Kennedy said, "All of us might wish at times that we lived in a more tranquil world, but we don't. And if our times are difficult and perplexing, so are they challenging and filled with opportunity." Their voices still guide us, reminding the world that dreams do not die with dreamers. They live on, generation after generation.